Hello, this is Dr. Willow Ariella again, moving on to Chapter 5. This is one of my favorite chapters. In addition to teaching sociology, psychology, domestic violence, social work, other classes, I also teach women's studies, and this chapter was really fascinating to me. Definitely, reinforced some research that I knew about, plus gave me a little bit better deeper look into evolutionary psychology, which I have my criticism of. But anyway, some things that I wanted to point out in Chapter 5. The thing about human diversity is really interesting. Humans are very, very alike in many ways, as Myers discussed and pointed out with research, and we're different in many ways. But the main point that he makes in this chapter is that we are much more alike in general than we are as individuals. In fact, he points out that siblings are much, much more different than people are in general. So I think that's quite interesting. He notes an anthropologist has identified several hundred universal behavior and language patterns. So that also helps us see how similar humans are, even though our differences seem to be quite enhanced in media and things like that. Evolutionary psychology. It's interesting. This is not a very old field. It hasn't been around that long, but there's quite a bit of research being done about it. Since I agree with the and believe or support or whatever you want to say, the evolutionary perspective, I think it makes sense to look at psychology and evolution. And so I appreciate the research that they've done. I still have my concerns. But anyway, let's see. The research close-up on page 160 reminded me of my own experiences, and some of you have probably had similar experiences when I was in Japan and Korea. I actually liked it because being in Japan and Korea, because I did not feel pressure to smile in situations where I didn't feel like smiling. It was actually quite refreshing. So I really liked that. I feel a lot of pressure in the United States to smile, and actually tried not smiling in social situations for a while, but found it very uncomfortable, which you could do that experiment yourself and see what you think. Let's see. On page 162, they talk about the higher status person is the pace setter in the progression towards intimacy, and as he discusses later on in the chapter, this goes from men to women as well. I really don't like his definition of gender. I don't think it's quite accurate. He mixes two concepts, gender and sex, and they're often used interchangeably, but again, I don't think that the same concept. Sex is about biology, our physical traits, specifically our genitalia, whether we're male or female, while gender has more to do with traits or behaviors that are typically associated with femininity and masculinity in a particular society. But you should use his definition, of course, for the exams. He mentions on an aside on page 164 that even physical traits, individual differences far exceed the average differences between the sexes. And what that means is that there's much more of an overlap between what men and women can do than there is a gap. So there's much more an overlap. If you think about it, what can a man do that a woman cannot do, and vice versa? There may be outliers, there may be extremes. There may not be that many women who can bench press or, pick up 500 pounds or whatever, but you know, what things are there that women absolutely cannot do that men can do, and vice versa. So if you think about that, I think you'll find that quite interesting. But he says your opposite sex is actually your nearly identical sex. But for some reason in our society and probably others around the world, we tend to emphasize differences between the sexes. He discusses independence versus connectedness on page 165, and you know, there's a lot of variety. I'm familiar with Nancy Chodoro and Keller Gilligan's work. I've done research and written papers and read several of their pieces. I'm also familiar with Tannen's work. You know, they look at relationships and how men and women do them and some of their differences. And then he mentions down at the bottom on page 165 about men gravitating towards certain kinds of jobs compared to women, but still part of this has to do with, you know, societal expectations and societal training for women and men. I loved his quote by Dave Barry. I think Dave Barry is really funny on page 166. Let's see. Social dominance, very interesting information, and he mentions that the perceptions of power and sex do correlate with reality, but there are exceptions to that, so that's also very interesting. I thought this research on page 165 was great, and again, this doesn't mean, you know, one sex is good and one sex is bad, but just interesting about the stock market, that men tended to take more risk, however, they underperformed or lost more money than women did. So I thought that was quite fascinating to see what the actual data shows. And then I thought it was great, his exploration of the reality of the men are from Mars, women are from Venus book, and that he re-emphasizes that books like that tend to greatly oversimplify, and I agree with that. Stuff like that is an oversimplification. Let's see, on page 170, I made a note to myself on the first bullet point, and then and then he answered my question. So I wondered if behaviors can be different, you know, because they talk about attitudes, and then he says that gender difference in sexual attitudes does carry out to behavior. So that was interesting to me. I was surprised that that was the case. And then he quotes some researchers on sex and the differences between sex and the perspectives for women and men. And then at the bottom he quotes another great Dave Barry thing about sex. That's great. I think he's so funny. And then on page 171, again, he re-emphasizes, and I want to re-emphasize, individual differences far exceed gender differences, actually to be sex differences. Females and males are hardly opposite, but they differ like two folded hands. And one of the things, oh, gotta stop.